At the time of this writing, Israel and Iran have been exchanging missiles for more than a week, and the US has dropped bunker buster bombs on various nuclear sites in the country. It remains to be seen how this will pan out, and perhaps many of the things I will review here won't apply to any regime that may or may not replace the one currently under attack in Iran. However, a good background to how we got here is in order. Before the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the country, led by the Shah, was an ally to the United States and part of Nixon's twin pillar strategy in the Middle East, focusing on Saudi Arabia and Iran as a counterweight to Soviet influence in the region and a steady supply of oil with an emphasis on the more population heavy and powerful Iran. This close relationship was not surprising, considering the CIA during Operation Ajax helped lead a coup to oust the nationalist leader Mossadegh to put into power the Western-leaning Shah. There are some revisionist historians who downplay the role of the CIA in this coup, but mainstream historicity does point to a prominent role by the Americans. Even so, the Shah was not necessarily just an American puppet, and wanted to establish himself and his country as an independent power, separate from just the US versus USSR paradigm. Regardless, anti-Shah sentiment was growing in the country as a leftist and Islamist alliance rose against the Pahlavi dynasty, only for the Islamists to turn on the leftists almost immediately after. Disdain for the Shah's autocratic rule and economic conditions were the main cause, as well as a disdain for his openness to the West, especially America. Many Iranian leftist intellectuals were blaming the US for many of the ills of the world at the time, but ironically Jimmy Carter preferred Khomeini to the Shah, seeing him as a pious reformer, and did not dissuade nor do anything to prevent him from taking power. This turned out to backfire on the US, in one sense similar to the US backing Mujahideen against the USSR, who later transformed into the Taliban. Almost immediately, American hostages were taken and held for over a year, effectively declaring war on the US, demanding that the Shah be sent back to Iran in exchange for the hostages. Ever since, relations between Iran and the US have almost always been negative, except, oddly enough, the period right after 9/11. But this too passed fairly quickly into poor relations once again, and continues to the present. I want to look specifically at US-Iran relations. Still, before I delve into that, a brief background of Iranian actions in the Middle East region is also necessary to show that Iran is not just concerned with America or its proxy in the region, Israel. Author Kim Gaddis, in her book Black Wave, points to the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran as the driving point behind most of the region's instability, at least since 1979, beating out the '67 war or the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, among others. Saudi Arabia led and continues to lead the Sunni world, being the birthplace of Islam, containing the holy sites, controlling the pilgrimage, exporting Wahhabi preachers, etc. Iran, on the other hand, after the revolution, was keen on exporting its brand of Shia Islam, countering the influence of Saudi Arabia. Although initially Saudi leaders welcomed Khomeini as a fellow Muslim, especially considering his anti-Israel views in contrast to the Shah, they saw that the new leader did not necessarily view them in the same manner. The Ayatollah saw the Wahhabis as deviant and wanted to exert more control over Mecca and Medina, vowing to liberate the former from the Saudi usurpers. One of his early books describes the rulers of Saudi Arabia as quote-unquote barbarians. He also encouraged Shia minorities in Sunni countries to revolt, and Saudi Arabia was no exception, with its substantial Shia minority uprising in Qatif. Around the same time, the siege of Mecca took place, albeit not done by a Shia but rather a Wahhabi fanatic protesting the supposed westernization of the Saudi monarchy. Rather than clamp down on religiosity, however, the Saudis saw both this act and the revolution in Iran as threats to their religious authority, and decided to double down on pursuing Islamic law and propagation in the country and abroad, which in turn encouraged the Iranians to do the same from their religious viewpoint. The Hajj itself was used as a political tool by Khomeini, who urged Iranian pilgrims to disseminate revolutionary ideals to other Muslims, eventually clashing with Saudi police in 1987, resulting in hundreds dead. The Saudis directly faced off the Iranian proxy in Yemen, namely the Houthis, a conflict which killed hundreds of thousands. However, most of the conflict between the two nations were not based in those countries as such, but other countries in the Middle East, where Iran wanted to bolster its proxies against the Sunni majority, or minority in the case of Iraq. In Lebanon, a country with a substantial Shia, Sunni, and Christian population, civil war broke out in 1975, sparked in part by the arrival of the PLO after being kicked out of Jordan following Black September. Iranian activists in the LMI also had a presence in the country before the war broke out, as parts of Lebanon became a gathering point for many disaffected types across the political spectrum. Ironically, in 1982, with the Israeli invasion of the country to help its Christian allies, many Shia in southern Lebanon welcomed them as they were relieved to be rid of Arafat and the PLO, who the Israelis were attempting to root out. These positive feelings did not last, and quickly Israelis were seen as aggressors and occupiers. Iranian Revolutionary Guards came at this time to the town of Baalbek, instituting strict Islamic law on the more laissez-faire, westernized city, and eventually started the foundations of the militant organization Hezbollah. This group would be the first to popularize the method of suicide bombings, first against Israel and Tyre, then on the French and Americans. Following the Israeli withdrawal in '85, Hezbollah consolidated power and eliminated many rivals, including leftists, mirroring what happened in Iran. From that time on until the present, it has been a substantial force in not only suppressing rivals, assassinating the Lebanese prime minister in 2005, but also backing Assad in Syria, although clearly has been defanged greatly in its recent fighting with Israel. The war between Iraq and Iran following the revolution also followed this divide of Sunni versus Shia, as well as Arab versus Iranian, as Saudi Arabia and others largely backed Saddam against Khomeini. Saddam chose to invade primarily due to Shia provocations brought on by the revolution, which were not alleviated after he killed prominent Shia clerics in Iraq, who ended up just becoming martyrs for the cause. Ironically enough, Saddam offered a ceasefire in 1982 to combine both Iranian and Iraqi forces to attack Israel after its invasion of Lebanon, something that Arafat was telling both countries to do. But rather than accept this ceasefire and move to attack Israel, which for all I know could have really ended badly for Israel, the Iranians chose to continue attacking Iraq in order to try and capture Karbala and other Shia holy sites in the country, coming up with the slogan, "The path to Jerusalem passes through Karbala." In another irony, Israel was one of the few countries to help supply Iran with weapons at the time, thinking they may still be friendly in time, as the Shah was, or at least saw Saddam as a bigger threat. Obviously, the Iran-Iraq war was devastating for both countries, and after Iran continued to interfere in Iraq, pushing the Shia uprisings in 1991, led by the Badr Brigades, helping to bring Iranian revolutionary rule to the country, or at least the Shia sections of it. This rebellion was quashed after Norman Schwarzkopf allowed Iraq to use helicopters after kicking them out of Kuwait. Not to mention IRGC involvement in post-Saddam Iraq after the US invasion, but we will cover that when we get to the section focusing on Iran and America. Likewise, in Pakistan, the Shia-Sunni split was the primary focus. Although Sunnis are the majority in the country, there are technically more Shia in Pakistan than in Iraq, in terms of number. The Pakistani leader at the time, Zia-ul-Haq, took power from Prime Minister Bhutto in a military coup and led the country in a more Islamist and Sunni direction. This caused revolts among the Shia in the country, who called upon Khomeini to support them, who in turn threatened Zia with overthrow if he was to impose non-Shia customs on the minority in Pakistan. Khomeinist groups grew in Pakistan who carried the same disdain of Wahhabis and Saudis as the Iranians had, but just like in other countries, Saudi Arabia also aimed to counter the growing Shia revanchism and spread its ideology into Pakistan as well. Eventually, this culminated in various attacks on Shia in the country, especially following the assassination of a prominent Sunni preacher, thought to be done by Shia radicals, although this was never confirmed. The situation was somewhat reversed in the case of Syria, where a minority Shia offshoot was in control of the country led by the Assad family. Saudi Arabia primarily supported rebel factions against the Alawite leader, whereas Iran via Hezbollah and direct IRGC leadership from Qasem Soleimani backed Syria, the front line of resistance, according to Soleimani. Both countries relied on foreign fighters from other parts of the Muslim world as well, with Iran recruiting Shia forces from Pakistan and Afghanistan to further its hold on the Shia crescent from Iran through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. This is not to exonerate Saudi Arabia or Qatar, who, while backing more moderate rebel groups, almost certainly directly funded ISIS, al-Nusra, and other official terrorist organizations. Even in countries with very little Shia population like Egypt, the Iranian Revolution had influence and showed that secular-minded rulers like the Shah could be overthrown or assassinated in the case of Sadat, who Khomeini called on for the Egyptian people to overthrow after his peace deal with Israel. This is not to say that Iran is the only country with agency, and one could argue in some cases Iran just acts in a way to help beleaguered Shia minorities with no ulterior motives who are just facing Sunni aggression, although Sunnis also don't always fare well in Iran either. All this to say really that while it takes two to tango in any situation, and both Saudi Arabia and Iran have agency, the rivalry between the two, which has been the root cause of Middle East conflict in Gaddis' view, did start with Khomeini and his revolutionary actions. Iranian actions are not limited just to other Muslim countries or just to take place in the broader Middle East either. Indeed, the constitution of modern-day Iran calls for globalized revolution in Islamic terms, and while there was debate mirroring the Stalin versus Trotsky debates vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and its revolution, the Iranian Trotskyites, as it were, won out. Plenty of aggressive actions have taken place against citizens of the US and European countries, and others within the Middle East and beyond. Already mentioned were the hostages taken in 1979, but those were not the only hostages that Iran and its proxies captured. Between 1982 and 1986, 96 foreign citizens were abducted in Lebanon by Hezbollah. Notable U.S. hostages working for the military were William Buckley and William Higgins, both of whom were stationed in Lebanon and were ultimately killed by their captors. Occasionally, international flights would be hijacked, specifically for hostage-taking, to ensure the release of Shia perpetrators of terror in Kuwait and Israel, in the case of Kuwaiti Flight 422 and TWA Flight 847 in Athens, respectively. One could argue that Hezbollah and other Lebanese-based groups were just trying to kick out foreign influence from their country, but this would be quite a stretch. The Lebanese government invited a multinational peacekeeping force into the country combined with a UN mandate, following Israeli entrance in the Lebanese civil war, and US troops had left the country before the assassination of President Gamal by a Lebanese Christian, and the Sabra and Shatila massacres, also by Lebanese Christians, ironically, but backed by Israel. But the US returned following these events. This was the backdrop to the 1983 US Embassy bombing in Beirut, and the Marine Barracks bombing the same year. The embassy bombing was more or less in revenge for US support of Israeli efforts in the country, which Reagan saw as part and parcel of his broader anti-Soviet strategy in the Middle East. Syria and the PLO were seen as Kremlin clients. The bombing of the embassy and deaths of Marines even before the barracks bombings created a rift in the White House as to either stay and enforce more pressure in Lebanon or cut and run. The decision to leave was also hampered by Lebanese forces asking the US to support them against their mountain war with the Druze, ultimately using US ships to fire on Druze positions that were backed by the Syrians and Iranians. This was the backdrop to the Marine barracks attacks that killed 241 Americans and 58 French soldiers. Israeli troops had already pulled out weeks prior, and Assad and the Iranians saw the use of naval gunships as a greater provocation as well as an impediment to standard warfare, leading to the use of truck suicide bombers. During this whole engagement, half-Jewish Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger was urging the pullout of US troops and disengagement in Lebanon as a whole, opposed to other figures in the administration. May have been a good addition to my previous article, see here. Iranian culpability in these bombings were quite obvious and more or less totally proven in 2003 when Judge Royce Lamberth found the Tehran government guilty in a court of law. Reagan ultimately did not respond to Iran and later pulled out of Lebanon entirely, much to the chagrin of some in the administration who wanted to see retaliatory strikes against the Islamic Republic, with Reagan more or less blaming the event entirely at the feet of Assad, sidelining Khomeini. However, this just led to the environment in which Iranian proxies were able to fester, leading to the aforementioned hostage-taking and plane hijackings. Forgot to mention more US servicemen who were taken hostage and killed, such as US Navy diver Robert Stetham. The embassy in Lebanon was not the only embassy targeted by Iranian proxies. The US embassy in Kuwait in 1983 was bombed, which led to the aforementioned Kuwaiti airliner hijacking. Even the embassy bombings in East Africa in 1998 by al-Qaeda have Iranian fingerprints, with some US officials pointing to Hezbollah helping al-Qaeda to perform these acts, with Iran's sanction. Obviously the Shia-Sunni split is real, but can sometimes be overlooked. Furthermore, these are only attacks on embassies that have succeeded. Others have been foiled before they could take off, such as the Saudi and Israeli embassies in Washington, D.C. Not US embassies, but literally in the capital. That were foiled alongside an attempt to assassinate Adel al-Jabir, the Saudi ambassador in the same city. Speaking of killing civilians in other countries, various non-Middle Eastern countries have had targeted attacks on either Iranian dissidents or their citizens, who the Iranian regime wanted to get rid of. Various Iranian dissidents were killed on French and German soil, including relatives of the deposed Shah, like Shrihad Shafiq in Paris, and Kurdish dissidents in a German-Greek restaurant in Berlin in 1992, as well as a handful of others in other European nations during the later 80s and early 90s, ultimately culminating in a couple hundred by the turn of the century. Dissidents were not the only target. Famously, Salman Rushdie had a fatwa put on his head for writing a book thought to be denigrating towards Islam, which eventually lost him an eye, and various translators of his works. US citizens were targeted as well, in Europe and even in the US, as revenge for the shooting down of the Iranian passenger jet by the USS Vincennes. The wife of the captain of said ship had her car blown up in San Diego, but was unscathed, and other reprisals were stopped by a combo of US, German, and Israeli intelligence. Frankly, if I counted all the botched operations by the Iranians, it would be a much longer article than it already is, as well as if I counted attacks against Israeli targets. However, I will point to the 1994 bombing in Buenos Aires, as it was the largest terror attack in the country's history, and even if one doesn't care about Jews, it still killed plenty of non-Jewish Argentinians. On the topic of Latin America, Iran does have a history in America's backyard as well. Tehran has had ties with the government of Venezuela, starting with Chavez in the 90s, allying with them under OPEC as well as selling them billions of dollars worth of weapons. It also helped the Castro regime in Cuba after the USSR collapsed, funded the FARC in Colombia against US-backed troops, and helped the Sandinistas against the US-backed Contras in the 80s. Also, because of various waves of Arab immigration to Latin America, Hezbollah had somewhat of a base of operations in Paraguay into the 2000s. At least one Venezuelan diplomat was kicked out of the US for attempting to retrieve info for a possible cyber attack on US infrastructure, who was allegedly linked to Cuban and Iranian consulates. While this attempt at cyber attack was not successful, the Iranian group APT-33, or Elfin, has had more limited success in attacking oil and gas infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, owned by Aramco, and successfully hacked into hundreds of universities and companies, stealing private data in 2018. In terms of US military personnel, the 1996 Khobar Towers attack in Saudi Arabia is probably the most well-known pre-9/11. This attack, carried out by Saudi Hezbollah with the backing of Iran, killed 19 American military members. What is interesting about this attack is that the Clinton administration at the time attempted to downplay the role that Iran had in the operation, similar to how the Iranian role in the Marine barracks attack was also downplayed or even intentionally avoided. Around this time, the Clinton administration wanted to pursue a new relationship with Iran under the newly elected President Khatami, who notably Madeleine Albright and others made positive overtures towards. But while there was some back and forth interaction, including a personal letter from Clinton to Khatami via Oman, nothing eventually developed in terms of lessened tensions between the two countries. Ironically, 9/11 and its aftermath was probably the most positive period between the Islamic Republic and the US. Iran condemned the 9/11 attacks and backed the US invasion of Afghanistan, as the Taliban were also an enemy of the Iranians. Men such as Iranian diplomat Mohammad Zarif and even IRGC Commander Qasem Soleimani, later killed by the US years later, were helpful allies in pushing Hamid Karzai to the fore of Afghani politics and battling the Taliban head-on respectively. This respite did not last long, however, and even though the Iranian government welcomed the toppling of longtime rival Saddam Hussein in 2003, they quickly used the opportunity to establish a presence in Iraq, which naturally led to conflict with US troops. Quickly after Saddam's fall, Iran worked diligently to establish more ties in the country, led by Soleimani. Various militant groups were directly supported by the IRGC, like Kataib Hezbollah and the Mahdi Army, and politicians like Jalal Talabani and Nuri al-Maliki had close ties to Tehran, often acting as intermediaries between the US and Iran. Famously, the Quds Force helped provide IEDs and EFPs to groups like the Badr Corps to use on American troops, killing hundreds and wounding many more. The withdrawal of US troops from Iraq in 2011 was a gift to the Iranians, who then turned their attention to Syria. But at the same time, with the rise of ISIS, following the withdrawal, attention was directed more towards the new Sunni terror group than anyone else, which again caused a brief respite in attacks between the Iranian proxies and the US. This didn't last too long, and after Soleimani helped strengthen Assad's grip on Syria, he turned his attention back to Iraq, and later Yemen, to help the Houthis, formerly known as Ansar Allah, in their attacks on US strategic ally and oil-rich Saudi Arabia. Between 2016 and 2021, the Houthis conducted hundreds of attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure and other targets that caused major backlash from the Saudis, with US support ending in a humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen. Other US allies' ships were attacked by the Iranians in the Gulf of Oman as well at this time, along with a multi-million-dollar US drone over the Strait of Hormuz. Other attacks on US military bases and installations in the Middle East can be pointed to, like those after the assassination of Soleimani, and others before and after. Obviously, the most recent being the very limp-wristed attack on a US base in Qatar that was symbolic only. And one can question why the US is there at all, or if these attacks were just retaliations to perceived slights or attacks from forces opposed to Iran. The fact of the matter is that the US has geopolitical goals in the area largely connected to oil and shipping lanes that Iran often hampers and opposes. However, another goal of the US, which will be the last point of contention in this write-up, is the desire to limit Iran's nuclear capabilities. 9/11 and the WMD era of the early 2000s were a huge shift in security concerns for the US, but even before, the issue of nuclear proliferation was of great concern. In the 90s, both North Korea and Pakistan successfully built nukes after both direct talks with Pyongyang and IAEA oversight couldn't prevent North Korea. Military strikes were on the table but refused by Clinton, and sanctions against Pakistan failed to curb their programs. These failures would later color how the US dealt with the Iranian goal of obtaining nuclear weapons. Also, even before the second Bush and many neocons came to power, a 1999 report by the outgoing Clinton administration pointed to Iran obtaining nuclear weapons at the end of the next decade. Indeed, Pakistan and North Korea are linked with Iran via A.Q. Khan, the father of the Pakistani nuclear program, who was instrumental in fueling nuclear proliferation amongst various countries. The first public revealing of an Iranian nuclear weapons program, however, was unveiled by the MEK, Iranian dissident group, known to have an esoteric blend of Marxist and Islamic beliefs, in 2002 at a press conference in Washington. Essentially, from this point on, there were talks amongst the US, Europe, and Iran to get a handle on the situation. President Khatami had put a pause to the uranium enrichment program in 2003 following the invasion of Iraq, but resumed it in 2005 after internal pressure from the IRGC. Around this time, European leaders also worked with Iran and the IAEA to get an agreement to permanently suspend the enrichment program, which Iran was not keen to do, telling Mohammad al-Baradei, lead inspector for the IAEA, who also worked on Iraq, that no Iranian politician would risk public disfavor by ending a program that Iran had endured so much to achieve. This could also explain why those same Iranian politicians often deceived IAEA officials in regards to its program, something that al-Baradei also discusses in his memoir, The Age of Deception. The US also engaged in talks, joining the previous E3 European countries along with China and Russia, forming the P5+1 group of countries dealing with Iran. Condoleezza Rice under Bush and later Zalmay Khalilzad offered various economic incentives to Iran in exchange for halting its nuclear ambitions and to come to the negotiating table. At this time, Ahmadinejad was president and was considered more of a hardliner on the nuclear issue. Military options were not really on the table post-Iraq War, as nobody had much of an appetite for a new war, although Dick Cheney had urged the Israelis to bomb specific Iranian targets. But this did not come to fruition. And by the end of the Bush second term, no real progress had been made, as every time talks would fail, as Iran would slowly expand its program to which new parameters to talks would then have to be assessed. Eventually, under Obama, a deal was reached with the JCPOA, which essentially limited Iran's nuclear program to only pursue peaceful means in exchange for sanctions relief with sunset clauses. This deal was criticized by both Israel and Saudi Arabia at the time, and other hardliners in the US. And as we all know, eventually Trump would later pull out of the deal, leading to more or less where we are today, with significant military action having taken place. I only wanted to give a broad sweep of the issue with Iran and its nuclear program because it is very easy to get lost in the weeds on this issue with all the technicalities. But I did want to point out something I heard on the Lex Friedman podcast in the debate between Scott Horton and Mark Dubowitz. Horton just dismisses the idea that Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons and also dismisses essentially all the claims about Iran attacking US troops in Iraq and even the Khobar Towers. Frankly, this is a cop-out. He also routinely stated that the 2018 Israeli intelligence gathering operation that revealed the Ahmad plan was Israel's implanting false intelligence to make Iran look bad. I ended up taking Dubowitz's advice and getting a copy of the Albright book, Iran's Perilous Pursuit of Nuclear Weapons, and literally in the prologue, Albright discusses the 2018 Israeli operation, its credibility, and how Iran wants nuclear weapons while hiding behind lame fatwas and subversion of IAEA inspections. One can point to Dubowitz's ancestry or place of origin, Canadian Jew, as an excuse to just totally dismiss his years of research, but I think it is a bit harder to do so with Albright. Frankly, I can understand from a neutral perspective why Iran would want nukes, given how it has protected North Korea and countries like Libya and Ukraine have been invaded after giving up their nuclear programs and nukes, respectively. However, the US does not want a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, and due to Iran's behavior that I have outlined here, why would it want a nuclear-armed Iran? One that is also working on missile programs that could eventually hit targets outside the Middle East. It's not that difficult to understand why we would want to see a stop to this, just in a realpolitik sense. One can argue that it may be the US allying with countries such as Israel or Saudi Arabia that have caused this, or that we are the aggressor here, but whatever one's thoughts on the subject are, nobody can deny that the two countries indeed are enemies, and it's not just some made-up theory from neocon think tanks. One can even argue that the US should not have bombed the nuclear sites in Iran and just left it to Israel, or even stopped Israel from escalating. Trump did indeed enforce a ceasefire on the two, as Israel was en route to bomb more. Perhaps it was a mistake to pull out of the JCPOA as well. All of these things can be discussed and argued, and on the opposite side, many hardliners, Iranian dissidents, Zionists, neocons, etc., have complained that the US has been too accommodating to the mullahs in Iran, and this conflict could have ended years ago, if not decades, by providing help to the various uprisings that have occurred within the country over the years. All this can be rather murky due to how convoluted the Middle East can get, and nobody wants another Iraq situation. And the only clear point in all of this is that Iran has agency, and, rather than acquiesce to US interests, it aims to provoke. If the leaders there were smart and wanted to stay in power, perhaps they would have shed their idealism about returning imams or whatever and just fall in line with US hegemony, but that is not what happened, and judging by recent events, they don't have much time to shift course.